to something within Israeli society which really describes and positions the Palestinian citizens as a so-called demographic threat. In other words, the Palestinian citizens, by their very existence within the state as Palestinians, constitute a threat. I mentioned Nazareth. One of the areas around Nazareth, quite soon after the creation of the State of Israel, became a target for this so-called Judaization, for land expropriation. An area of land was taken from Nazareth using a law that permitted the confiscation of land for so-called public use, right, for public purposes, which in some senses sounds perfectly normal. What happened was, or the way that law was used, and not just in the case of Nazareth, was that the majority of the land, the vast majority of the land, became the basis for the creation of Nazareth Elite, Upper Nazareth, which was a so-called Jewish development town that was built in the Galilee as part of this Judaization strategy. Now, just to show you how these kinds of the land confiscation and the ideas that shaped the rationale for them comes right through to today. This following quotation is from the current mayor of Nazareth Elite, right, Jewish Upper Nazareth that overlooks Palestinian Nazareth built on the confiscated land of Nazareth. This quotation from the mayor of Nazareth is from about a year and a half ago now, from Nazareth Elite. He said, "The State of Israel's plan was that 45% of the Galilee will be Jewish by 2010. In reality, we are less than 40%. And if the state doesn't make sure to bring Jews here en masse, we will lose the Galilee." He doesn't need to say, in his context, lose to whom, right? And it's worth reflecting on this kind of quotation, on this kind of ideology. Like if I talk about the UK, for example, I know political groups, thankfully marginal fringe political groups in the UK, who say, quote, the idea is that there's too many of the wrong kind of person in a particular area, and we need more of the right kind of person in that area. We all know where to place that kind of ideology on the political spectrum, and I imagine many of us would have immediate feelings towards that kind of political ideology. But here we're not talking about a fringe, marginal phenomenon. We're talking about policies that have been implemented at the highest level within Israel, nationally and locally. I mean, the mayor wasn't sacked, for saying something like this. It wasn't a scandal that he would say something like this, referring to Palestinian citizens. It's routine discourse. The last example that I want to talk about in terms of the Palestinian reality inside the State of Israel for the minority are unrecognized villages, so-called unrecognized villages. Now, what this phenomenon refers to is the fact that in the 60s, Israel passed legislation that was designed to more efficiently zone and organize land and planning within the state. Again, so far so normal. What you'll discover frequently with Israeli Apartheid is that so-called kind of neutral-sounding legislation is used for with ulterior motives. Anyway, so they do the planning legislation, and they start zoning the state according to purpose: residential, non-residential, green, all that kind of stuff. And the way it was used was that pre-existing Palestinian villages were marked as being in so-called non-residential areas. So in other words, at the stroke of a legislative pen, these communities cease to officially exist because they're not on the map. They're not zoned for being residential, even though they were there before. And that reality continues to today. Many of these communities face severe problems in connecting to basic infrastructure, if they can at all, in terms of water, electricity, schooling, etc. And there are around 70,000 citizens, right, citizens of the only democracy in the Middle East, who live in these conditions, especially in the Negev area in the south. This is an example of one of them. Hope you can see that. Okay, I took this picture in January of this year. You can see in the background Beersheba, like the Israeli city, and in the foreground is a Palestinian unrecognized village of Hasham Zana. Now you can also see a road, a highway going behind it. I'm standing on a slight kind of hill. The other side of the highway, directly opposite this Palestinian unrecognized village, is Nevatim, which is a moshav. It's a Jewish agricultural community. You can see it's 100% recognized, it's agricultural, so there's a lot of irrigation, it's very green, and it's separated by a highway from the Palestinian unrecognized village. And I don't need to spell out any clearer what is the difference in terms of who merits what kind of treatment and services. This is another example, just quickly, Ismail from Damash. Damash actually isn't in the Negev area. It's not that far from Tel Aviv, in between Lod and Ramleh. And Damash is another so-called unrecognized Palestinian village. In this case, there's an added bitter irony, because the Palestinian citizens in Damash were actually moved there in 1951 by the Israeli authorities, having been expelled from their land. And they were moved to Damash in 1951, an area that was zoned eventually as being agricultural. As time passed, of course, the agricultural conditions were oppressive for the community, because it meant you couldn't build certain things there. And what happened was the land around Damash, which was also agricultural zone, was rezoned for residential building. To build what? To build Jewish communities. And until today, Damash continues to be zoned as an agricultural community. And there are demolition orders pending on around a dozen of their houses. I didn't take this picture myself. This is from the news wires. This is not Gaza. This is not the West Bank. This is inside Israel, in the Negev. And this is Al-Araqib. It's another Palestinian unrecognized village. And this year alone, I think it's even 6 times now, this village has been destroyed and demolished with bulldozers and Israeli riot forces, riot police here. Again, these are images that are routine images for Palestinian citizens living in the so-called only democracy in the Middle East. I'm going to move on just to give you a couple of examples, or to explain a little bit about the reality for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, because it's different there. East Jerusalem, occupied by Israel in 1967, of course, and what happened there was that very soon after 1967, Israel unilaterally expanded the municipal borders of the city of Jerusalem, the municipal boundaries. And they did it in a way that meant that a chunk of land from the West Bank was annexed to create Jerusalem, expanded Jerusalem. That's an act of annexation that's never been recognized by the international community. That's why there aren't any embassies in Jerusalem, for example. And of course, one of the main purposes of expanding the municipal area of Jerusalem was to colonize it. And a third of that annexed area, since 1967, has gone to the creation of settlements. Settlements, again, which are illegal under international law. There's now about 190,000 people living in these settlements in East Jerusalem. And look at this statistic from the UN last year. 87% of annexed East Jerusalem is unavailable for Palestinian construction. This is the open, united city that Israel's propagandists and the mayor of Jerusalem, etc., are talking about. In East Jerusalem, 13% is the area that the Palestinian population has to use. Palestinians in East Jerusalem, almost all of them, aren't citizens of the State of Israel, but nor do they have the same ID as West Bank Palestinians. They have a permanent residency. Except, this isn't so permanent, because it can actually be stripped from them by the Interior Ministry with the municipality. In 2008, this was a particularly bad year, 4,500 Palestinians with East Jerusalem ID were stripped of that by the Israeli Interior Ministry. Sometimes, if you're a Palestinian, that happens to you, you don't know until you actually go to engage in some way with the municipality, whether it's the post office or to get health insurance, something like that, and you find that you don't exist anymore on the records because your residency has been taken from you. And this was the conclusion of European Union monitors on the ground about this kind of policy. Quote, Israel's main motivation is almost certainly demographic. And it's that unpleasant word again that crops up time and time again when analysing Israeli policies towards the Palestinian people. In other words, the EU is saying that the reason why Israel is stripping Palestinians in East Jerusalem of ID is because it relates to the strategic objective of maintaining a certain level of Palestinians within the city that is deemed appropriate. There's an interesting guy called Meron Bedvanisti, who's an ex-deputy mayor of Jerusalem, written some books that I recommend you chasing up. And this was his observation. Actually, just before that, just another illustration of this. This is from the Jerusalem Post newspaper headline, reasonably recently. Jerusalem Mayor Barkat, near Barkat, Arab population in capital, a strategic threat. Again, think what kind of politics labels a group of people intrinsically a threat. The existence of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem is considered a threat. The Benveniste quotation I was talking about, the ex-deputy mayor, it's pure racism. We live in the only city in the world where an ethnic population ratio serves as a philosophy. In other words, this aim of maintaining this ratio, this appropriate ratio of Jews to Palestinians within Jerusalem, informs subsequent policy decisions related to land zoning, relating to permits to build, etc. It also, of course, informs the collaboration and work between the municipality and radical right-wing settler groups, many of whom also get donations from places like the States too, who are on the ground Judaizing the area. I'm going to move on as well now to some examples from Palestinians in the occupied territories. Now actually, I'm not going to really talk too much tonight, at least in my presentation, and it might come up in questions, about the Gaza Strip. Now that's not because conditions aren't horrendous. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have the worst situation out of all the Palestinians under Israel's control at the moment. But I want to focus on some aspects of Israeli apartheid that aren't always well understood, perhaps aren't even heard about at all, and particularly with regards to the issue of land, which is really at the heart of the conflict. So I just want to explain about why I'm not talking much about Gaza in this presentation. What I want to major on in terms of the West Bank are two aspects of Israeli policy, two aspects of Israel's regime of control in the West Bank, which are the settlements and home demolitions. Today, since '67, Israel's constructed over 130 illegal settlements in the West Bank. Illegal according to who? Illegal according to the international consensus, right? Who contests the illegality of the settlements? The settlers, obviously, the Israeli government. But then they're left with very few allies, internationally speaking, except Zionist lobby movements, right? The illegality of the settlements is affirmed in the United Nations, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Just in the last week, Amnesty International called the settlements themselves, just the settlements, a war crime. Of course, the settlements themselves don't just kind of exist in isolation. They require infrastructure to connect them up to each other. Roads, natural resources, security buffer zones, that kind of thing. And what you have in the West Bank today is a classic example of a regime of separation and inequality. Why? Because in these colonies in the West Bank live Israeli citizens, many of whom perhaps moved to a settlement, then moved back into Petah Tikva or Tel Aviv or Netanya, maybe they're working there, and the settlement is kind of like a commuter town. So they're Israeli citizens subject to Israeli civil law, they vote in Israeli elections, etc. Around them, all around them, are Palestinians who are subject to Israeli military law. Palestinians who in the middle of the night can be taken from their bed by Israeli soldiers and subjected to a farcical show trial, a military show trial, and sent to prison without recourse to proper due process. So it's a regime of separation and inequality, where in the same geographical area, there are two population groups with different rights afforded to them. And this is a point, again, that can be an issue of confusion when it comes to settlements, because even in the Western mainstream media, even in the US, perhaps even on Fox, I don't know, I never watch it, so the issue of settlements is discussed in the context of the peace process and, an obstacle to peace, all that kind of stuff. Well, the settlements are also often linked to the Israeli right? Likud, Netanyahu. Often a kind of mainstream liberal position can be, it's going to be difficult to advance the peace process when you have someone like Netanyahu in power because of the relationship between the Likud and the settlers, right? That's a very kind of standard idea to hear. But actually, the colonization of the West Bank, the settlement project, has been advanced by Israeli governments regardless of the political makeup. It's a consensus issue. Settlements were created and consolidated and maintained by Labour, as well as Likud. And this is just an example. 93 to 96, the 3 years after, after there'd been the shaking of hands by Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, the height of optimism about the so-called peace process. In those 3 years, Israel boosted the population of these illegal colonies by 50%. That was the significance of the peace process for Israel. And I don't mean that sarcastically. That was the cover that the peace process provided and continues to provide